can you tell me, send me any documentation you might have on UFOs. I didn't expect to get anything. 6 months later, I got a phone call at work from a guy who turned out to be a very surprised FBI agent. And he said, gee, I didn't know we had all this stuff. There's over 1,000 pages. And he said a lot of it's duplications and so on. I'll be happy to select out the best ones and send them to you. So he sent me 400 and some pages of documentation. And over the next year or so, they released the remainder, which turned out to be 1,600 pages. And if you've got the time and effort and a high-speed internet connection, you can download this jumble of pages. They're not in historical order. They just occur in a random order. You can download this jumble, 16 5-megabyte PDF files from foia.fbi.gov. That's the Freedom of Information Act site for the FBI. And by the way, if there's anybody else, your neighbor, yourself, some nasty relative, whatever, that you want to check up on and find if there's an FBI file, you'll probably find a file on them too. You know, even J. Edgar Hoover had his own file. You'll find files on Tesla and Marilyn Monroe and so on. So this talk is based on combining the FBI files with the Air Force files and the CIA, and that's all in this book. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the details that I've put into the book, but I'm going to try to give you a flavor for what happened with the FBI. As I said, it's based on documents obtained from the Air Force and the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act. In 1955, Edward J. Ruppelt wrote in his book, and here's one of the reasons I thought there was nothing on the FBI file. The FBI was never officially interested in flying saucer investigations. Now, Ruppelt wrote that in 1955. He was the head of the Project Blue Book in 1952 and 53. 1966, a UFO investigation. This was a statement to a newspaper reporter who wanted to know if the FBI had ever done anything. And the newspaper reporter was told the UFO investigation is not, never has been, a matter within the jurisdiction of the FBI. And that was J. Edgar Hoover writing. And then in 1977, the FBI released 1,600 pages of non-existent documents. It's not kind of hard to read non-existent documents, but I managed to do it anyway. And we find that within days of the first sightings of flying saucers, the FBI headquarters began to receive newspaper clippings about the sightings. But the FBI didn't do anything about it until the Air Force asked for help. You can find in the FBI file the FBI liaison agent's description of his contact with General Shulgin, the chief of the Intelligence Requirements Branch, Army Air Force Intelligence. This is before the Air Force was a separate organization, so it was called the Army Air Force or the Army Air Corps. And the chief of the Intelligence Requirements Branch. Intelligence requirements. What is it that we need to know in order to be able to understand something that's going on? This was July 9th, 1947, location in Washington, D.C., and the subject was, can the FBI help the Army Air Corps determine whether or not communist subversion or communist subversives were generating spurious saucer reports? Here's a copy of the document right here, and you get the CD and you can actually read it word for word. General Shulgin told the FBI the scientists of the Air Corps are trying to solve the flying saucer mystery. It had only been around for 10 or 12 days. Saucers might be a celestial phenomenon or a foreign body mechanically devised and controlled. And could reports be coming from communist sympathizers trying to cause fear of a Soviet weapon? Essentially, they were worried that communist sympathizers might generate spurious reports in order to undermine the confidence of the American people in the ability of the Air Force to control the skies. So Shulgin told the FBI that he would make available reports by the Air Corps scientists. He assured the FBI that there were no secret projects that could cause flying saucer sightings, and this statement crops up many times over the early history because people couldn't believe that these things were real and some belonged to somebody else, so they must be our secret projects. He said that he had interviewed a pilot who was adamant that what he saw was a flying saucer. So General Shulgin himself had talked to one of the witnesses, in company with a psychologist, by the way. Assistant Director David Ladd recommended against doing this. He said a great bulk of these alleged discs reported found have been pranks. Now we're talking about objects that were actually picked up off the ground. And yes, that's true. There were a lot of people throwing things into neighbors' backyards. Hoover's good friend, notice I've emphasized good. For those of you who know, it was Hoover's very good friend, his very, very good friend, Clyde Tolson. He wrote, "I think we should do this." And Hoover responded, "I would do it, but we must insist upon full access to all disks recovered. For example, in the Louisiana case, the Army grabbed it and wouldn't let us have it for cursory examination." Here is a document. Up at the top there, Ladd's recommendation against, Tolson's "I think we should do this," and Hoover's response down at the bottom. Again, if you get the CD, you can actually read the writing. The Louisiana case was a hoax object thrown into someone's backyard, and sure enough, the Army found out about the sighting and they grabbed the object. Now you see, the FBI would take something like that, an artifact, analyze it, try to find out if there were parts from foreign countries, any evidence at all, you know, of who might have made it. So the FBI wanted to examine it to find out if there was any connection to known communist subversives. And I might mention that, by the way, the Roswell case does have a document in the FBI file. The FBI was told by a Major Cretan that the material was being shipped to Wright Field, according to the document that was written about 6 p.m. the evening of July 8th, the same day that the story broke in Roswell. But I don't really have time to go into that. That's really, you know, those of you who have heard Roswell lectures know that you can go on for several hours just about that one event. But anyway, this established a UFO link between the FBI and the Air Force. It basically created a file inside the FBI in which they put UFO-related information. Because the FBI was directed by Congress to store records forever, that is, records that were at headquarters have to be stored forever, it has become a window on Air Force activities because it collected information. It was told things by the Air Force that the general public wasn't told. And you will see that that includes the interplanetary possibility. So in late July, a message was sent to special agents in charge. This is SAC. You find that terminology turning up throughout the documentation in the FBI. "You should investigate each instance which is brought to your attention of a sighting of a flying disc in order to ascertain whether or not it is a bona fide sighting, an imaginary one, or a prank. The Bureau should be notified immediately by teletype of all reported sightings and the results of your inquiry." So in other words, this is, go do it, guys. The special agents in charge were further told, "It is possible that some sightings were generated by subversive individuals for the purpose of creating mass hysteria." And the Air Force stated to the FBI that it is possible to drag disc-shaped gliders behind aircraft. When released, they would descend at a tremendous speed. Notice that the Air Force was trying to come up with an explanation that made sense to them that these objects were real, and how in the world could they be doing what they are doing? Why were they shaped like discs? Well, somebody decided you could drag a disc behind an airplane and just let it go, release it, and it will be whirling around, I suppose, and travel for quite some distance at high speed before it crashes into the ground. But you would expect to find a lot of these discs lying on the ground. I should point out that in this first flap, if you, again, if you get the CD that covers my talk from yesterday, in the first flap in 1947, there were probably thousands of sightings reported in newspapers throughout the United States and even some throughout the world. So there were a lot of sightings going on, but the Air Force only managed to collect a few of them. And the FBI interviewed somewhat over a dozen witnesses during about a 2-month period. They found no subversion, no evidence of subversion. Many reports were filed under the heading, get this, Security Matter-X. There was a real X-Files, folks. So when Chris Carter invented that show, if he had called it the Y-Files, he would have been wrong. One of these is the first unexplained report in the Air Force Project Blue Book file. And here's the first unexplained report, the report of Fred Johnson. The first publicized sighting, however, the one that was publicized, was that of Kenneth Arnold. Arnold reported 9 objects, one flew one after another southward past Mount Rainier toward Mount Adams, about 50 miles to the south of Rainier. Fred Johnson was prospecting near, that should be near Mount Adams, not near Mount Rainier, when the objects passed by, and he observed them through a telescope. This is a map showing Mount Rainier up here at the top, a dashed line showing the path of the objects according to Arnold. He was in his little airplane there, and Fred Johnson, the prospector, was down near Mount Adams, and he saw the things go overhead. Sometime in July, Fred Johnson learned of Arnold's sighting from the news stories. He wrote to the Air Force to say he saw him too. The Air Force requested that the FBI interview Johnson, and the FBI concluded that Johnson was a very reliable individual who had been prospecting in the West for about 40 years. And according to the interview, Johnson saw them fly by at an altitude above his 5,000 feet. He was about 5,000 feet above sea level, and he thought they were 1,000 feet above him. He observed them through a telescope. He was the first witness to use optical aids. His compass needle wobbled as they went by. He was the first to report an electromagnetic effect. They were overall round, about 30 feet in diameter, he guessed, and tilted back and forth as they flew. Arnold had reported the same sort of wobbling as they flew along. Johnson said his sighting occurred soon after Arnold's, which makes Arnold the first person to see them. So why isn't Arnold's the first unexplained Project Blue Book case? And the answer to that is Project Blue Book claimed that Arnold saw a mirage, which makes no sense. Overall, over the years, there are about seven explanations been offered for the Kenneth Arnold sighting, none of which make any sense upon careful analysis. But as far as the Air Force is concerned, Arnold's sighting was explained, but they couldn't explain Fred Johnson's. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because the compass wobbled, or maybe because he looked through his telescope and saw them, or maybe it was because the FBI thought that Fred Johnson was a reliable witness. Other sightings that the FBI investigated included a Navy pilot sighting on August 6th in Oregon, police chief and other policemen sighting in September 13th in Portland, Oregon, and the Snake River Canyon, Idaho sighting by an AC, I don't know what that stands for, Urey and his sons. This is a case of closely viewed disk that was chosen as one of the 12 best sightings between 1947 and 1952 by the Battelle Memorial Institute, which is included in the Project Blue Book Special Report 14. Again, if you get the CD that covered the talk that I gave yesterday, I have in that CD a 60-page paper which discusses a lot of this stuff. It's got its emphasis on the year 1952, but it gives a lot of the background, like what was the Battelle Memorial Institute doing investigating flying saucers. Here is a page out of Special Report 14 that was done published in 1955. It talks about the farmer's sighting, where he saw this object, he and his son saw this object going down a canyon. They lived in the Snake River Canyon, and this object was seen between them and the opposite canyon wall about 400 feet away, going along and making the trees swish around as they traveled. And so if you look at the Air Force file, you find that it's described as an atmospheric eddy, a little whirlwind going down the down the canyon. A whirlwind that had tabs on the side, a flat bottom, a dome on the top. That's a pretty good whirlwind. And by the way, air tends to be transparent. This object was opaque. Anyway, in a preliminary Air Force evaluation of the flying saucer situation is found in the FBI file, but not in the files of the Air Force. It was written late in July 1947 and says that reports chosen for veracity and reliability indicate not all imaginary or seeing too much in some natural phenomenon. Something is really flying around. Metallic, circular objects oscillate or wobble while flying. No evident propulsion means. And this document, which was written in late July of 1947, was echoed in the famous letter by Nathan Twining in September 23 of that year. The FBI officially investigated for about 2 months. In September, Hoover was informed of an Air Force memo that said the FBI was brought in to investigate the cases of ash can covers, toilet seats, and whatnot. In other words, Hoover gets a document saying, hey, by the way, they are giving us the trash stuff, and to relieve the other Air Forces of investigating cases that are hoaxes. And Hoover said, that doesn't sound too good to me, we're out of it. As of October 1947, the FBI was officially out of the flying saucer UFO business. In spite of the order to cease investigation, the FBI headquarters continued to collect stuff from the Air Force. So the FBI acted like a black hole. Information went into storage and never came out, at least not until 1977. Now at this point, the FBI took a breather from UFO activity. There's not much in the FBI file from the fall of '47 until they got sucked back in January of 1949. But during that time, major things happened with the Air Force. And here I sort of have to give a history of what was going on in the Air Force as quickly as I can, because I want to get back to what the FBI was doing. It was during 1947 and 48 that the Air Force investigated. By the end of 1947, or fall of 1947, the Air Force had a pretty good idea that there were real things out there flying around. Nobody knew how they operated. They had particular characteristics sufficiently odd that you see, Air Force Intelligence wrote an analysis of flying disc reports and concluded the observers were reliable. There were some multiple witness sightings. Discs were able to hover. Discs could appear suddenly as if diving from a high altitude. And this is interesting. Discs can disappear or disintegrate. In other words, they could suddenly leave so fast you couldn't see. And, you know, anybody who's read this literature very much knows that there are sightings, descriptions of reports where somebody will be watching an object and then suddenly it's just gone and they don't know where it went. Discs take evasive action, and there's no evidence that the USSR or any other country is involved. So Air Force intelligence agents were asked to gather information on saucer sightings based on the elements of essential information. Elements of essential information, what we have to know. And the justification for collecting this information was an alleged flying saucer-type aircraft or object in flight approximating the shape of a disc has been reported by many observers from widely scattered places such as the USA, Alaska, Canada, Hungary, Guam, and Japan. The object has been reported by many competent observers, including rated U.S. Air Force officers. Sightings have been made from the ground as well as from the air. So this is a document that was sent to intelligence agents throughout the United States and throughout the world saying, get us all the information you can. They had a whole bunch of characteristics that were correspond to these essential elements of information. And again, one of these was the ability to disappear by high speed or complete disintegration. That doesn't happen to ordinary planes, we hope. Although there was a report on the internet just a couple of days ago about some airplane that seemed to crash into some object in midair. It broke up and the crash was so high, it hit something so hard it broke the engine. Anyway, the Twining letter of September 23, 1947 concluded that the witnesses were not crazy, objects that were really flying around and so on, and a special project was needed to understand what was going on. It's important to keep this early Air Force opinion in mind because in the future the Air Force tried to pass it all off as misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions by witnesses. So the Air Force took its own advice and set up Project Sign in January of 1948. And that began the 21-year investigation of the impossible, flying saucers. Starting in early 1948 and continuing through the spring and summer, the Air Force analyzed sightings as they came in. They had a couple of hundred by the summer and then a big one, so-called child-squidded aircraft sighting. This stuff is all described in greater depth in the book. Child-squidded sighting was two pilots who saw an object that was cigar-shaped that seemed to have windows in it go zipping past their aircraft. There seemed to be another sighting that correlated with it. So anyway, at this point, the people who were doing Project Sign had more or less concluded that these things were real, and they wrote an estimate of the situation. The estimate of the situation was written by people from the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and there was another document written by people who were at the Pentagon, two separate intelligence groups, both part of the Air Force, who were analyzing this subject. The Air Force intelligence at the Pentagon tried to tie in the possibility that these flying saucers amounted to a big jump in Soviet technology based on German war research into semicircular craft. In other words, could the Soviets have gotten a hold of German information that would allow them to create semicircular craft or circular craft that could fly around? The Project Sign, have ATIC, the Air Technical Intelligence Center Project Sign was part of ATIC, was more daring. Their estimate of the situation was saucers are interplanetary. The analysts at Sign were experts in aeronautics. They would be entrusted with determining whether or not Soviet craft were more or less capable than ours. They concluded the only sensible explanation for flying saucers was not misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions, but rather interplanetary. They sent their document up through the chain of command. It got to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Vandenberg, and he said, sorry, wrong answer. They went up there to try to defend their position. Now, these are the experts in aeronautics, you know, and they are accustomed to trying to back engineer things that we get a hold of or just from descriptions by witnesses, you know, of new technological developments. So General Vandenberg, I don't know what investigation he might have done, but whatever it was, he didn't like the result that the project sign people were coming up with. He said, sorry, wrong answer. Up to that time, late September 1948, analysts had 6 possible types of explanations. Hoaxes, which the Air Force has always admitted was only a few percent. Our secret craft, but that was rejected by the top brass. Soviet advanced craft, but it was hard to believe that the Soviets would fly their most advanced aircraft over enemy territory. What if something crashed and we got their secrets? Delusions, which are mental states of the witness. Misidentifications of natural man-made phenomena, which is certainly the largest fraction of UFO reports. Misidentifications. And also interplanetary craft was, at that point, an allowed potential explanation. After Vandenberg said, sorry, wrong answer, give me another answer, they crossed off interplanetary, and that left only misidentification, hoax, and delusion. And you'll find that for most of the time of Project Blue Book, it was like the Procrustean bed type of thing. You fit the UFO report into a type of explanation. You chop off information that isn't there, that is there, but doesn't seem to fit with an explanation. You just ignore that and accept the information that agrees with the explanation you like. So the consequence of the Vandenberg's rejection really was a loss in morale of Project Sign people. They were being told they could not use as an explanation what seemed to be them to the most logical. So it made for bad investigation from then on, except for a period of time in 1952 and 53. But anyway, Cabell, after receiving the Air Force intelligence report, wrote to the Air Materiel Command, the conclusion appears inescapable that some type of object has been observed. Identification in the origin is not discernible. It is imperative to determine whether or not they are domestic or foreign origin in order that defensive countermeasures may be taken. And 3.5 years later, a similar statement was written by another guy. So they got into a mode of operation there that just kept repeating itself. We need more information to find out what's going on, but oh, by the way, if we come up with a solution, it better not be interplanetary. So while the FBI was sleeping, the Air Force was carrying on all this stuff and set the stage for what happened next. In November, December, in particular December 5th, 1948 was a big day in the Southwest. There were a dozen sightings of green fireballs seen traveling north-south. These were initially thought to be either flares, green flares that somebody launched, or meteors of some sort. If they were flares, could they possibly be related to sabotage? The FBI had been asleep since September of 1948, or it's actually since September 1947, that should be. The FBI, however, was responsible for protection of vital installations. Vital installations was a code word for A-bomb related, atomic bomb related installations, where they were building and testing designing and building bombs. Green fireballs and the disk variation were seen over these vital installations, and hence the FBI was dragged back into it. Things were called green fireballs because they were green. However, a meteorologist, Lincoln La Paz, who saw one, rejected the normal meteor explanation. Sightings continued through December into January 1949, when the FBI was suddenly given new information on the flying saucer program. A man at Oak Ridge, who was the head of the Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft project, Colonel Gasser, told the FBI that, as far as he knew, the Air Force believed flying saucers were missiles. He personally believed they were Soviet missiles. And he said the presence of flying saucer missiles gave an impetus to the Air Force's Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft project. So in other words, the fact that flying saucers were there and they considered them to be real things, they were real sightings, you know. Maybe they had the wrong explanation, but they were real objects. It gave an impetus to our own research into advanced aeronautics. On January 31st, headquarters FBI received a report on green fireball and disk sightings near vital installations in the Southwest. Dr. La Paz said that these green fireballs were not normal meteors. La Paz, talking to the FBI, speculated that they were missiles launched in Russia. We don't know what Hoover's reaction was to having confirmation of possibly Russian origin. So in January, he gets told by this Oak Ridge Air Force colonel that the Air Force thinks that the objects are real and that they're missiles, and this man thinks they're from the Soviet Union. You know, we wouldn't be sending missiles over our own country. And now Dr. Lincoln La Paz, who was an expert in meteors, says, gee, these green fireballs that we've been seeing, they don't seem to be, they're not normal meteors. and La Paz argued that they might be Soviet missiles. So the FBI was getting this information from two different sources. In February 1949, the FBI received 50 copies of an Air Force sighting form requesting information on unconventional aircraft, and basically this was the first sighting form that was published by the Air Force in detail, listing all sorts of aspects of any particular report. This indicated the Air Force was serious about UFO investigations, even though it publicly panned them. And by this time, the Air Force had changed the name from SIGN. It closed out Project SIGN, changed the name to GRUDGE. In 1949, the FBI issued a directive to the special agents in charge which said flying discs are believed to be man-made missiles, and that the USSR was engaged in experimentation on an unknown type of flying disc. Evidently, information reaching Hoover clearly indicated that flying discs and fireballs were a potential threat to the United States. During the spring of '49, there were many sightings of these green fireballs and the disc variation. It made it out into the news. There were so many of them. The Air Force publicly and privately acted unconcerned, claiming sightings were all natural phenomena. In other words, they said publicly what they were saying privately, that there was nothing to it. Meteor expert La Paz repeated his opinion, not normal meteors, and he said if they're not ours, they are Soviet. Then a famous newsman by the name of Walter Winchell, a radio commentator, reported that he knew that flying discs were actually Soviet missiles. He said this over the radio. An FBI agent said, gee, shouldn't we interview Walter Winchell to find out where he gets his information? And Hoover wrote back to the FBI agent saying, the information that was given to Walter Winchell is correct as far as we know from what we've been told. This referred back to the people who had told him that they were, the guy who had told them that they were missiles back in January of 1949. And there will be no interview of Walter Winchell. Well, why not? And I suspect the answer is that Hoover was Winchell's source. Hoover and Winchell had been pretty close together, starting in the 1930s when Hoover was a G-man going after the alcohol trade and during the Prohibition. And so anyway, I suspect that Hoover, worried about this fact that the Air Force was poo-pooing all these missile sightings, went to Winchell and tried to stir something up by giving Winchell this information. No sooner, the day after Winchell's commentary on the radio, the Air Force came out with a public statement poo-pooing the whole thing. Nevertheless, these phenomena continued. And about 3 weeks later, an Air Force colonel told the FBI that there was no authentic information on flying saucers, which contradicted the previous stuff that this was real and flying on Soviet missiles. Nevertheless, sightings at vital installations continued. During the remainder of '49 and well into '50, the FBI received a few UFO reports and passed them on to Project GRUDGE. The GRUDGE staff analyzed 228 of the 370 reports obtained during 1947 to '49, and in December of 1949 announced that all the sightings had been explained and that Project GRUDGE was closed. Well, this was just a political ploy, really. It was not a scientific event. They claimed to have explained all sightings, but anyone who read the report could see that they didn't. The Air Force lied to the public. GRUDGE was not closed, but downgraded in importance. Flying disc sightings continued to occur, and the Air Force decided to set up a special project which was called Project TWINKLE in April of 1950. Since 1947, the Air Force had received contradictory information from the Air Force. Saucers are real, not visionary, and so on. Saucers are not our secret project. Saucers, fireballs, are Soviet missiles. Saucers are not Soviet missiles. No authentic information on saucers. In December 1949, the Air Force had explained all the sightings. GRUDGE was closed. The Air Force was no longer interested. January 1950, Air Force Intelligence sends out a new sighting form and wants more information on unconventional aircraft that don't exist because we proved they didn't exist, right? How can you imagine you can well imagine a poor FBI agent getting a little bit confused over what's going on. And if that wasn't bad enough, in March of 1950, the FBI received information from an Air Force officer that a saucer had crashed. This was the beginning of what we call a Newton-Jabbar hoax. It was written up by Frank Scully. But the fact that the document came into the headquarters saying a saucer had crashed led Hoover to ask the Air Force. He said, go take an agent, please go to the Air Force and ask them what the heck is going on. Just what are the facts with respect to flying saucers? And the Air Force the representatives of the Air Force and the Pentagon said a 2-year investigation explained all of the sightings, and there's no active investigation to determine whether saucers exist or what they are. So, once again, things were shut off. Then late May 1952, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a famous pilot, publicly stated the saucers are real, our secret craft. The Air Force response, in a confidential memo from Project Grudge, which still existed, was Rickenbacker is wrong, they're not ours, and saucer sightings must be attributed to mass hysteria caused by the tense international situation. So we've gone from discs being dragged by aircraft as a potential explanation in 1947 to mass hysteria in early 1950. In August 1950, the special agent in charge in Antonio, Texas, said that the Air Force was concerned about continued sightings near sensitive installations, including green fireballs, objects moving at high speed, discs, and so on. This document makes reference to Project Twinkle. Again, you can read more about it in the book. La Paz still says if they're not ours, then they must be Soviet. Where had the FBI heard that before? Was Hoover confused? If he was paying any attention, I'm sure he was. Project Twinkle, however, was successful. Cinetheodolite film allowed for a triangulation obtained on April 27, 1950. They found that there were objects 30 feet in diameter, 150,000 feet high. We didn't have anything that would go that high back in those days. Flying rapidly over a test area near Holloman Air Force Base, a White Sands Proving Ground. This success was covered up in the final report on Project Twinkle. This by itself is a paper that I presented at the MUFON Symposium one time. It's in the book. It's proof 2 ways. Number one, proof that flying saucers are real, and proof that they were covered up. Because you can see in the report that the guy wrote how he ignored, here's the document that came out of the Blue Book file that describes the triangulation. So anyway, Special Assistant David Ladd updated the situation with respect to Twinkle in early October. The FBI was told by AFOSI that sightings had all been explained as balloons and meteors. There were no spaceships or missiles from any other planet or country. This comes out of an FBI document. There was no mention in the document of several White Sands UFO films, so apparently the FBI was not told of the successful triangulation of 30-foot objects at 150,000 feet. The Air Force public statements always played down the importance of fireball and disc sightings. The Air Force claimed all explained, no Air Force interest. But in October 1950, Headquarters FBI received from Director of the Air Force Intelligence Cabal, guess what? Another request for information, of sort of a sighting form and a report format, indicating the Air Force was still interested. Sightings continued at Oak Ridge. Now, there are a number of really interesting things that happened in Oak Ridge in the fall of 1950, investigated by the FBI, the Counterintelligence Corps, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft Project, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And they concluded that sightings were impossible to explain, and they have a very interesting phraseology after they list a whole bunch of possibilities that these sightings could be that were rejected. And they say, finally, the ultimate rejection is because of the impossibility of explaining these sightings. So there must be something really going on. And then on December 8, 1950, there's a teletype message from the special agent in charge in Richmond, Virginia. This is very interesting because December 8th, 1950 is only a couple of days after the U.S. almost went on a high alert for objects that were flying over the northeastern coast of the United States. Why would the Counterintelligence Corps be interested in flying objects that the Air Force says don't exist? And this document in the FBI file is the only one of its kind. I checked with the Counterintelligence Corps people, and they couldn't find any documentation on this event. Yet we know that on December 6th, when unknown objects were flying towards Washington, D.C., from the Truman Archives, Atchison biography, and a document found by accident, found in a file down in Washington, D.C., written by a guy by the name of Winkle. We know what happened. And the President was informed that the radar had picked up objects traveling towards the United States. They went on a sort of a semi-high alert for a couple of hours until these objects went away. Nobody ever figured out what it was that actually happened. Again, this is in the book, and it may be related to a crash that supposedly occurred in December over the south of the Texas-New Mexico border, Texas-Mexico border, I should say. Well, the FBI had very little activity in 1951. Despite public pronouncements, the Air Force continued to quietly collect saucer and UFO reports. In September 1951, a radar visual event at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which was a major event, caused an explosion of interest in the Air Force intelligence. Investigate immediately. And the director of Air Force intelligence at the time, a man by the name of Cabell, had been assured that sightings were receiving proper investigation. But as a result of the Monmouth investigation, he learned that UFO investigation at Air Technical Intelligence Center had become a joke. People were losing files, things were misfiled. Whenever a sighting came in, they would think up whatever sounded reasonable to them as an explanation and then file it as being explained. As Ruppelt put it, there were no feathers in the cap for leaving sightings unexplained. If you wanted advancement, you'd better play with the party line, which was all sightings can be explained. Well, Cabell, who's the head of the Air Force intelligence, doesn't look at it that way. He wants good intelligence. He was angry. He called the GRUDGE report, which had been published in December of 1949, saying that all cases were explained and the Air Force was closing the project. He called the GRUDGE report worthless tripe. In other words, he could see through the facade, you might say. As far as he was concerned, there wasn't any good work in the Project GRUDGE report. And he said perhaps we shouldn't have announced the closure of GRUDGE. Anyway, he asked for a reorganization and reinvigoration of the project. Reorganization occurred under a new leader who was promoted eventually to Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the first guy to run the project with a straightforward scientific sort of orientation. Early in 1952, plans for better investigation to obtain physical data were, the plan was generated by a General Garland, and the name was changed to Project Blue Book. And in April 1952, before the plans were put fully in force, the flap begins. And here, 1952, was an hour-and-a-half lecture that I gave yesterday, just in this 1 year. I don't have time to go into it in detail here, but it's on the XCon CD that I told you about. If you can get your eyes off of Maryland and up into the right-hand corner, you'll say this is there is a case for interplanetary saucers. And notice, by the way, the lower right-hand corner, this copy is in the FBI file. That's how I found out about it. Life magazine, April 7th, 1952. Well, looking at some statistics, in 1951, they were getting about 14 sightings per month throughout 1951. Starting in 1952, January, February, March, and so on, you have 10, 19, 17, 91, 70. Look at April. It jumps from 17 in March to 91 in April, 70 in May, 111 in June. Whatever happened to 14 per month? And this was just the beginning. This is the beginning of this paper. Like I said, you get the CD and you can read the 60-page papers. It's just on this 1 year. The year that the Air Force established the tradition that there is nothing to UFOs. I'm just picking, I could spend an hour just on this one topic, which I did yesterday. From early morning to July 20th to midnight, July 22. Here is a sighting geography. 7 in New Jersey, 2 in Colorado, 2 in Illinois, 2 in Michigan, 1 in Pennsylvania, and so on. You can read all that stuff, including Germany, Mexico, and Morocco. Total of 51 sightings in that period of time. 24 states were represented, and the District of Columbia, 14 by military observers, of which 6 were at Air Force bases. Don't tell anybody. Now, remember, the Air Force position is, if you see a UFO, don't look. They don't exist. Well, what was happening? Were people going crazy? Were they looking? Well, the press woke up also at this point. How could they ignore what was going on? Associated Press, Dateline, Dayton. An Air Force spokesman today said there had been 60 reports of flying saucers in the last 2 weeks, and he could give no reason for why. And here are some newspapers that you can read. Again, if you get the X-Files disc. Things really heated up when there were saucers over the Capitol. On July 19th, you had Washington radar involved. You had visual sightings, and over the next 2.5 hours, commercial pilots and so on were involved, fast-moving lights, like nothing he had seen before. These are all statements taken out of government documents, FBI documents included. Some newspapers from around the country. On the 25th, a week later, Saturday night, 9:15 p.m., 4 to 8 radar targets in the D.C. vicinity described by radar operators as good, sharp targets. And F-94s were launched from a base in Delaware, and they came flying over Washington, D.C., and one of them was picked up chasing an object. They saw two things happening on radar, and it pulled away from the pilot, and the pilot said he remarked at how great the speed was. Again, July 26th. These are on weekends, the weekend of the 19th and then the following weekend. So you had commercial air people seeing it, radar detecting objects. On this night, there were actually representatives of Project Blue Book in the radar tower watching this go on. I'm going quickly because I have to complete this talk. So on July 29th, the Pentagon held one of the largest and longest press conferences since the end of the World War II, and it had nothing to do with the Korean War, which was going on. I haven't had time to talk about the background stuff, you know, everything else that's happening in the world, while the UFO phenomenon is being superimposed on that. But the Korean War was going on. Anyway, General Samford, who was the director of Air Force intelligence starting in early 1952, presented a prepared statement. There's the voice of reason right there. I haven't got time to read this, but notice he talks about 1,000 to 2,000 reports that have been received. We've adequately explained most of them, but there's a volume of reports that have made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. Credible observers. This contradicts, you know, what the Air Force has been saying, that the people who report flying saucers are all nuts and kooks. And there's no pattern that indicates a threat to the United States. Well, during this press conference that lasted 80 minutes, the news reporters, of course, asked the general what he thought was going on, and he said that he thought that what happened in Washington, D.C. was essentially a radar mirage, a temperature inversion that caused the radar to pick up spurious targets on the ground, and all the other sightings that were going on throughout the United States were natural phenomena. Here's the Washington Post the next day: Air Force lays saucer blips to heat. Saucers are hot air. During the same day, now here's where the FBI file really shines. During the same day, probably before the late afternoon press conference, the FBI contacted the Air Force intelligence for information on sightings. Why are there so many sightings going on? Why are we hearing about this? The Air Force staff at the Pentagon told the FBI a different story. This is the staff in General Samford's office. The Air Force said something that the staff said something that Samford didn't mention, something that's out of this world. Here's a copy of the document, July 29, 1952, FBI document, to advise at the present time the Air Force has failed to arrive at any satisfactory conclusion in its research on flying saucers. That's not what the Air Force was saying. This is a piece of the document which says he advised that it is not entirely impossible that objects sighted may possibly be ships from another planet, such as Mars. This is a summary of the document, which you can read either in the book or on the CD. Some sightings, 2 to 3%, have never been satisfactorily explained. It is still possible that these objects may be a natural phenomenon, but it is not entirely impossible the objects sighted may possibly be ships from another planet, such as Mars. No conclusive evidence of this, but the possibility is not being overlooked. Now, if Samford had said at the press conference, well, yes, we're seriously considering a possibility that interplanetary vehicles could be involved, the lid would have blown off. Instead, the lid was on. The fix was in. If General Samford had admitted to the press that interplanetary was possible, UFO history would be different. Instead, he withheld information, which you can read as covered up. The cover-up continues. Well, let's look at 1952, the year of the UFO. July 1972, 782 reports of 536 objects. August, 397 reports. September, 162, October, 92, and so on. So something happened in the summer. There was this big bulge of sightings. Nobody knows yet what really was going on. And I doubt that we really have a total collection of all the newspapers that had stuff. But anyway, one sighting had more than the average effect on people, on the opinion of the intelligence. This was Navy warrant officer Delbert Newhouse, who saw with his wife some objects while they were traveling through Utah in July. Now, he was a professional Navy photographer, was experienced in doing aerial photography. When he looked up in the sky, he could identify stuff that was up there. His wife see these objects going along, which looked like a saucer or a pan with another one on top inverted. he got out, he looked at them, decided they were unusual, stopped the car, got out, took the camera out, and started to film the objects. By that time, they were a considerable distance away, and the film simply shows points of light moving around. Some of the original George Bush's points of light, I guess. Anyway, he reported that they were circular, looked like two pie pans, one inverted on top of the other. Newhouse got the movie camera out of the trunk of his car, loaded it up, and got some film. They made tiny images on the film with no particular features. He turned his film over to the Navy for evaluation, and the Air Force Photo Lab at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base also studied the film. After several weeks of work, the photo analysts ruled out birds, balloons, and other aircraft. No one knew what the objects were. Word of this extraordinary evidence eventually had an impact on Air Force opinion, and a reference to the impact of this film appears in the FBI X-file in October of that year. Here are just the little dots of images on one of the frames. Here's a document which says, some military officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. The FBI memorandum I just showed you, October 27, 1952, Colonel C.M. Young, Executive Officer to Major General Samford, reports, a small percentage of extremely creditable sightings has not been explained. Here is an extremely creditable sighting. Navy photographer, and it goes on and summarizes what happened. Film was studied, 12 to 16 flying objects recorded on the film. Possibility of weather balloons, clouds, and other explainable objects has been completely ruled out. The FBI report says the Air Technical Intelligence Center at a complete loss to explain this most creditable sighting. Air Technical Intelligence Center experts point out that they could not be optical illusions, and as much as optical illusions could not be recorded on the film. So Colonel Young advised the official position of the Air Force was it could all be explained, but some military officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships, and as I pointed out yesterday in my talk, according to Ruppelt's private notes, General Garland, who was one of the guys who gave an inspiration to the Life magazine article that appeared in April of 1952, saying that things were interplanetary. General Garland was a UFO witness. So he was at least one of the military officials seriously considering interplanetary ships. If the Air Force, well, okay, as I already said, if the Air Force had admitted what they were thinking, UFO history probably would be different. In the summer of 1952, now this is let's see. Yeah, after the panel of experts I refer to here explained everything, this is referring to the Robertson panel in January of 1953. After 1952, the FBI received very little information about the Air Force. Now, I should point out that at this point, in the book, I have a chapter on what the CIA did. But because I don't have time to go into that, and I'm just concentrating on the FBI file itself for this talk, we have Senator Richard Russell's sighting in the Soviet Union, which caused a stir in the FBI and the CIA while he was riding on a train near a place called Baku near the Caspian Sea. And that sighting by itself is of considerable interest because it really caused a stir. Why? Senator Richard Russell was the head of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. So here was a big man, and you can read what he personally said. You know, we have been told that these things don't exist. Now we know they do. In 1956, an FBI employee had a sighting along with her boyfriend, an employee of the NSA. What do you think of that, Scully? They reported it to the FBI. The FBI sent the report to the Air Force, but it's not in the files of the Air Force. I wonder where it went. And the last case investigation is one of the most important cases that's happened because of its impact on J. Allen Hynek. April 25, 1964, the sighting by Lonnie Zamora of a craft that landed near Socorro, New Mexico. It just so happened that when Zamora, as a policeman, called into the headquarters to say he saw something, there was an FBI man in the office. And that guy went out to interview Zamora and provided the FBI with a considerable amount of information. There is one missing time or abduction case in the FBI file. It occurred on January 18, 1967. It occurred in Chesapeake, Virginia. The guy called up at 4:10 in the morning. The FBI says his name is censored in the document, of course. Reported it to the FBI. He had observed a large oblong-shaped object on the street in front of him as he walked from his shop to his home. This would be about 8 o'clock at night. The craft was glass-like and transparent. Creatures were humanoid but short, wearing regular pants and T-shirts. He was transported for a distance and returned about an hour later, he thought. The FBI report says he spoke in a coherent manner, although he claimed to be under emotional strain. He claimed he had not been drinking any intoxicants, but was unable to account for the time between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., missing time. He stated he was telephoning from his workshop, but had no recollection of being elsewhere between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. So what happens? The FBI checked to find out if he had a criminal record, couldn't find him in the listing of potential criminals, and of course it did not investigate this, it just filed a report. We don't know whatever happened, we don't know who the guy was, we don't know whatever happened, but it sounded like it was a very interesting abductions case. And this was, at that time there was only one abduction case really that had been publicized, and that was the Betty and Barney Hill case. When Carter was president, he promised to release all UFO data if he were elected in 1976. Well, maybe he actually tried. In June of 1977, Jody Powell, who was an assistant on Carter's staff, contacted the FBI to find out if there was any UFO investigation. The FBI replied no, and there was no reason for the FBI to investigate. So here's a summary of the UFO-FBI connection. The FBI did officially investigate early on, established a link, which established a UFO link to the Air Force. The importance of the FBI file is that it stored information provided by the Air Force. The FBI information, when combined with Air Force and CIA documents, show how muddled was the publicly known Air Force investigation, signed, GRUDGE, and Project Blue Book. And the FBI documents show what the Air Force didn't admit, that interplanetary was considered to be a distinct possibility for many of the unexplained sightings. Thank you. I guess if there's any time left. Is the next person here?
Hang on, I'm coming, Bruce.
You're going to be using the PowerPoint? If there's a question, I'll try to answer something quickly. I can't see anything out there. I'm blind.
Project TWINKLE.
Project, yes?
Why did the military regard that as a confirmation of UFOs that they had photographed way early in their investigation?
Did they? You asked why did they consider it a confirmation or something?
No. Why didn't the Air Force consider that a confirmation of UFO reality when they had that photograph way early in their investigations?
I don't know what photograph it is you're talking about that they had.
Project TWINKLE. They had a photograph.
Project TWINKLE resulted in photographs through cinetheodolite, a special type of telephoto camera with a telephoto lens. And they basically, the guy who wrote the final report on that didn't even mention that there had been a triangulation. Very few people knew about it.
Cut it off. Folks, before you leave, there have been some change. First of all, Bruce, thank you so much. Bruce, WTTG, Fox News, Washington, is right out there. They want to interview you right now. There's a fellow with a camera, Pat, coming in. Interviews are going. The media is starting to show up. BBC News, British Broadcasting System contacted me for an interview, and I got so distraught working on my other stuff, I blew the interview off, but I think they'll be back to us. We have some changes here. Phil Corso, who was moved to 11:30 because of a plane, has been moved up even further to 11, okay? And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's Ballroom B. And in addition, Bill Burns, who was going to be simultaneous with Phil Corso in the Crystal Ballroom, they're going to come together and join forces. Which is cool, right? Because obviously Bill Burns co-authored the book with his father. They will be presenting together in Ballroom B at 11 o'clock, and they'll probably go a little long, give a little extra time. So the Corso Burns combined together, Ballroom B, 11 o'clock. And the only other thing, folks, I want to say is that we may have some audio-video problems through the rest of the day, some improvising and so forth. So please be kind to us. We got away with murder for the first day, but we're probably going to have some problems today. So that's it. We'll have the next lecture in here in about 5 minutes.